Welcome to Biology of Marine Mammals. I'm Dr. Leslie Williams, and this is the second part of a lecture titled Pinniped Evolution. In the second part, we're going to explore the two hypotheses that are purported for pinniped evolution. Then we're going to go ahead and take a look at the evidence: zoogeography, which is the fossil record, morphology, and DNA. And from all of those pieces, we'll arrive to a winning hypothesis, what is essentially currently accepted as the correct hypothesis for pinniped evolution. So previously, we purported that there are two hypotheses for pinniped evolution, one of which is the monophyletic hypothesis, which basically says all of the pinnipeds arose from a common ancestor. And the second is the diphyletic hypothesis, which basically states that otariids and phocids evolved from different ancestors, otariids being more similar to bears, and phocids evolving from a weasel-like ancestor. And the diphyletic hypothesis, the position of walruses is somewhat obscure. So we're going to ignore walruses as we move forward and take a look at which hypothesis gets more support from our collection of data. So as we move forward, we're really only going to be looking at otariids and the phocids, and then at the very end, we'll explore where walruses fit in the evolutionary tree. All right, so the first piece of data that we're going to look at is zoogeography, which essentially is the fossil record. What does the fossil record tell us about where these different lineages evolved? The otariids evolved most likely in the North Pacific along America's shores. And that's where we see the earliest fossils going anywhere from 12 to 15 million years ago. We see some of the earliest otariids. Now, there's actually a very rich fossil record of phocids that date back to also about 15 million years ago, but in a completely different ocean. And that's the Atlantic Ocean and also the Eastern Atlantic on the European shores. So how is this evidence interpreted? Well, as it turns out, this piece of evidence makes a very strong case for diphyly, or the diphyletic hypothesis, because diphyletic proponents basically state that because the fossil record shows that early otariids and early phocids evolved in completely different oceans, they must have therefore evolved independently. In other words, the Pacific and the Atlantic are completely separated, and therefore this strongly suggests they evolved independently of each other, and that similarities that we see are the result of convergent evolution. Now, proponents for the monophyletic hypothesis suggest that perhaps one group evolved first and then actually migrated through the Arctic waters during warmer times. So back around 15 million years ago, the Earth was warmer, and so that passageway would have been warmer, basically to establish a distinct lineage in the other ocean. And this, of course, would have been a classic example of allopatric speciation, where you have a geographic separation, separating two populations, and then they basically evolve in different ways to cope with their different environments. And that's what monophyletic proponents suggested maybe happened instead. While that scenario definitely supports diphyly, it turns out there was a new piece of evidence that has been recently added to the data collection, and that is the fact that in the Carolinas, there was a new phocid seal fossil found that dates back somewhere between 22 and 29 million years ago, which of course is older than any other fossil for either otariid or for the phocids. So that new piece of evidence basically changed the way monophyletic proponents thought about the zoogeography, and of course weakened the argument of the diphyletic proponents. So what do the monophyletic proponents say now? Perhaps the origin of pinnipeds was not actually in the ocean. Perhaps the origin of pinnipeds actually happened in rivers and lakes and freshwater environments, maybe even estuaries, somewhere in North America. And that from there, we have the phocids, which are represented in blue, basically migrating towards the Atlantic coast migrating into the water and then swimming across the water to establish a robust population in Europe, where the Otariids basically migrated the other way and went to the Pacific coast and pretty much stayed in that region throughout the course of their early evolution. So that new picture suggests a much stronger hypothesis for monophyly. All right, what about the morphological data? There's actually huge bodies of data about morphology, and all of them are very difficult to look at. So what we're going to do is I'm going to first just describe how phocids and Otariids are different as a whole, and then we're going to take a look at one more easily looked at piece of morphology, which is their flipper morphology. So as a whole, phocids tend to be better adapted to aquatic environments than Otariids, and Otariids tend to be more amphibious. So for example, when you take a look at phocids, they're not nearly as well adapted to move on land, and they tend to be better divers. Also, phocids can spend prolonged periods of time out to sea, months and months and months, and that doesn't usually characterize Otariids. In the converse, you see Otariids spend a lot of time on land, and because they do spend so much time on land, you can see in their flipper morphology that they're a little bit better adapted to using their limbs for movement on land than phocids are. So let's go ahead and take a look at the flipper morphology. So Otariids and phocids, when you take a look at them as a whole, tend to have similar flippers. Upon first glance, you might notice that the phocids just have more stunted flippers than the Otariids do. However, there are some more distinct differences. For example, when phocids are in the water, they tend to use their hind flippers for propulsion, where Otariids in the water, they use their front flippers for propulsion. But also, even on land, we can see some stark differences in their flippers and how they can be used. Most notably, when phocids move on land, they move in kind of a caterpillar crawl, and their flippers are there to help stabilize them, but they don't really rely on their flippers to move quickly on land. In contrast, the Otariids definitely use their flippers to move about on land. So they'll often be propped up on their front flippers, and they use their enlarged front flippers to help actually almost walk, kind of a waddle on land. And moreover, they can even take their hind flippers, rotate them underneath, and use their hind flippers for movement as well. So Otariids can use all four flippers to move on land, and phocids barely use their front and hind flippers at all, but more as stabilities, and use their body to move instead. All right, so how is flipper morphology used in the argument for evolutionary relationships? Well, those who support diphily basically say that the flippers are utilized in totally different ways, suggesting two totally different ancestors. Any morphological similarities that we see are the result of convergent evolution. In contrast, we see with the case for monophyly, we tend to see that those proponents say flipper similarity is the result of homology. In other words, because they arose from the same common ancestor, their flippers are similar, and they have since evolved to use their flippers differently depending on their land-water usage. In other words, Otariids use land more often, so they've retained flippers that have more use on land, where phocids are in the water more often, and so their flippers are used more for water propulsion and less for land propulsion. So that's basically where the arguments stand. I would say it's pretty much a coin toss about which argument is stronger at this point. So let's go to our final piece of data, which is looking at molecular data, or DNA. I'm not going to show you the details, but DNA and all other molecular data strongly supports the hypothesis that basically phocids and Otariids are more closely related to each other than either group is related to weasels or bears. In other words, Otariids and phocids come from a monophyletic family. They are monophyletic, and they evolved from a common ancestor, and probably the closest known relative is likely to be the bears. So Because the molecular data so overwhelmingly supports monophyly, monophyly has been adapted as the current hypothesis for pinniped evolution, and diphyly has fell strongly out of favor. So now that we know that we're looking at a monophyletic tree, that leaves the question of walruses somewhat questionable. Walruses, which evolved probably after the phocids and maybe even after the otariids, nobody's really sure where they go. And to date, as of 2010, it's still somewhat of a question. So where do we see the walruses? Before we get into that, let's actually define the walrus. There's only one surviving species of this once robust family, and all the rest of them have gone extinct, and of course that one species is the walrus. The walrus is divided into at least 2 subspecies, and they are found exclusively in the northern hemisphere. And one species lives in the Arctic Pacific and the other lives in the Arctic Atlantic, and so those represent the 2 subspecies, perhaps on their way to speciation to create 2 unique species because they don't mate with each other. But as of right now, we're still looking at one species. So when you first look at a walrus, you might suspect they're really closely related to the phocids. Walruses are large. They tend to also have reduced appendages, more like phocids do, and they have a huge blubber layer, and they lack the ear flaps that also characterize phocids. In fact, in our cladogram lecture, we said walruses and phocids were more closely related to each other than they were to otariids. However, molecular data suggests possibly the opposite. Molecular data suggests that actually the walrus is more closely related to the otariidae, or the otariids, and not to the phocids. So that brings up something of a conundrum. The morphological data and the molecular data don't agree. And because of that, pinniped evolutionary biologists are hesitant to strongly support where the walrus actually goes. But as of 2010, most current literature says the walrus basically is an early branch of the otariids, and that they're more closely related to the otariids than they are to the phocids, which seem to have evolved first. So this is basically our tentative cladogram based on all available data. So we have bears as our ancestor. Then we basically have the phocids evolving somewhere between 20 and 29 million years ago, first all in the Atlantic, but first along America's shores and then migrating out to Europe, where they radiated and then basically spread throughout the world. Then we have the walrus evolving somewhere around 15, 16 million years ago, and then finally the otariids. And that's basically what we're looking at for our pinniped evolutionary hypothesis. But remember, it's still a hypothesis. We don't know the truth. All we can do is add more data to our data matrix and try to refine our hypotheses as we learn more. And with that, I'll see you next time.